Welcome everyone back to our fireside chat series. My name is Hiba. I work with Pencil and Paper and Enterprise UX Studio based in Canada. And for today's fireside chat, we have Helen, who is the Director of Open Source Initiatives at 10up and is a lead dev at WordPress, and Ceara, who is the CEO and lead UX designer at Pencil and Paper. For anyone that's new, this fireside chat series is about hearing about UX design from the perspectives of developers, something that you don't get to hear very often. And we wanted to have a conversation, between a designer and a developer around some of the topics to do with creating really good software and good user experiences that people actually like to build, design, and use. So we're going to be doing some myth busting. There's going to be none of that developers don't care about design or don't like design. We're going to be getting in there on a couple of topics that that both Helen and Ceara have a lot to say about. So the first question that we're going to get started with is one that that we've come across a lot as people are thinking about, doing a UX course or some kind of some sort of skills building around design, which is developing design instincts. So Helen, I'd like to kind of firstly have you introduce yourself, but also I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you go about developing your design instincts, whether you have formal training or whether you don't, and maybe what has your experience with that been in the past?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think an intro will help kind of put all of this in context. So you introduced like my job and my function. So within the WordPress project, but also in my role at 10up as the director for our open source initiatives, which includes like WordPress plugins, but generally like how do we interact with and how do we take part in this broader open source ecosystem. So a big part of that has been, even though I'm a developer and I definitely think of myself as, developer engineer, whatever you want to call it, one who has really good UX and UI instincts and can be trusted to kind of make those decisions on the fly, right? So like I wouldn't be making mockups necessarily myself. I feel like it's not the greatest use of time because I'm not fast with it like a lot of people are, because I don't practice it. But like, when you're in the middle of developing something, right? Like I can be trusted to kind of make those decisions that need to be made in the moment to keep you moving, to keep moving you forward, right? And I don't feel that sense of protectiveness about my decisions, which is a pretty common thing across everybody. Like it's a human thing, right? Like you've worked hard on something, you feel defensive about it. And so for me, it's also very much like letting go of that feeling of like, I need to protect my baby, right? Mm-hmm. So like I can make a decision in that moment, but like if somebody comes in and it's like, hey, let's try changing it up, or maybe this isn't actually working out, like not hanging on to that. So I think that's been a big part of what's brought me to where I am today. To kind of focus in on the WordPress world, but this does apply to lots of different things. But for the moment, I'll just talk about WordPress because that's where I live and breathe right now. In the WordPress area, there are a lot of developers who are super smart at what they do, but they never actually use WordPress like a person, right? Mm-hmm. The thing that they call like dog fooding, which I think is super gross, like if you think about it, but the dog fooding, right? Where are you actually using your software the way that somebody who doesn't write the code for that software uses their software? Mm-hmm. And I feel like for a lot of people, and not just I feel like, when I talk to people, they don't, right? Like you don't have developers who are spending their time writing in WordPress or figuring out like, how do I change a theme without screwing everything up, right? Like, how do I get a site out there? How do I kind of scaffold up a site without having to get into code? How do I construct a page, right? Because like page builders are super popular, but I feel like it's sort of the developer navel gazing in a lot of ways, right? Where they think like, well, if I give them the tools to do all of the above, right, then I can be hands off. And it's like, but no, because it's just really complicated, and like actually using one, frankly kind of sucks, right? Like when you have to use a page builder. So
I feel like actually from a design perspective, that sometimes can be the case as well, right? Where you're kind of, and Ceara, what do you think about that? Like where you're working on a flow, it looks pretty nice, it looks, making it snazzy, making it, making it shine. And you're like, well, it's so intuitive. It's so, of course, somebody would like to use it. But maybe designers also don't get to really like use products as real users as well sometimes.
Yeah. And I think the thing is that, like, the vast majority of UX people, they have the right motivation of being user-centered. But unfortunately, when you get to really high fidelity design and you're starting to make it cute and you're starting to be like, wow, this concept is like coming together in kind of a cohesive design or cohesive flow, you lose your objectivity like instantly. I don't know, like in an afternoon. When you get to that high fidelity level, it's like, maybe there's ways to kind of like jolt yourself out of what you already know or what you're already kind of getting a little attached to or a little bit kind of boxed in by. But it happens really fast. And, I'm sure it happens with code as well.
Oh, all the time. Yeah, we call them rabbit holes, right? Where like suddenly you're thinking about like, what language should I pick? Or like, what framework should I pick? Or how should I name the variables in my file? Like you just fall in these little holes where it's like, it does matter, but it's like not your true North Star, right? And that's where like when we talk about, should developers know basics about design or should they be able to do design? And it's like, I don't know at that part, but the thing for me is that, again, I agree, like for anybody deep in their discipline, it's really easy to lose sight of this. I feel like developers in, the software space carry the biggest chance of kind of losing sight of what the real problem we're solving for is, right? Because we start thinking about solving for our own problems. And you can see this in the developer space. There's just like huge proliferation of developer tools. Something we found in WordPress years ago, we were running user tests on something. Through watching people work through the script, we actually found a different problem that seemed much worse, that was much more important to solve, which is that people were unable to find the publish button. It would get lost. Like, yeah, you're thinking like, if you use WordPress, you're like, well, duh, it's like up here in the top right corner. Just think about it, the top right corner. Like, yeah, duh, it's up there. But the thing is, if you use WordPress, gosh, what would this have been, like 7 years ago, something like that? It was in that panel, but it would scroll up with the rest of the page, right? So you're making like some super long posts, or you're managing stuff that's like in a bunch of boxes or whatever, your publish button has like gotten lost way up in the top. And what we ended up doing was instead of worrying about like whatever this thing we were testing was, we ended up coming up with a way of kind of like sticking that sidebar in a smart way as people navigated around the page so that the publish button was always there, because that is your primary action. And to have these hours and hours of user tests where our conclusion was like, maybe we don't care about this feature right now. And what we really need to worry about is like, can people find the freaking publish button? I think it was like really eye-opening for a lot of developers who work on WordPress. And from there, like the WordPress project has really invested a lot more in, how do we run user tests? How do we document these tests, involve more people, all of that stuff. And so that's what's been, I don't know, that's what excites me as a developer, honestly, because like without those user space problems, I kind of feel like maybe I don't care as much about solving these things. Like some people are driven by solving for developer problems, and like, bless you all, because you're making my life easier. But for me, without that like user land thing that I'm targeting, like I feel a little like, I don't know what my motivation is as a developer, and I think, yeah, and like I said, I think that that's a big part of like, why do people trust me with UX? If I'm like, oh no, I really like PHP and I'm like, reasonably good with front end stuff, it's because we share the same priority, right? Like we share that priority of like who our user is.
If you as a team lead would like to kind of make your team or the developers you're working with think in a more UX centric way, what are some of the things that that you've either put in place or that you'd like to put in place, be it from an upskilling perspective, be it from just a straight up educational perspective? what are some of the things that you'd like to try in your team or that you're already trying right now?
Yeah. We for the engineers, like it very much, like, again, we try to tailor it, of course, based on the individual. But some typical things we'll have them do are things like walk me through this thing that you're building. Like I was saying, like, can you verbalize like all those little micro decisions that you're making, right, as you go, because each of those things is impacted by what the broader UX is, right? So can you explain to me how like you would go through using this thing that you're building? Things like, tasks that often feel like, a burden to get through, but things like writing out your functional requirements, right? So like, can you explain to me in 2 sentences of plain English, what is this site about, right? So 10up is a consulting agency, right? Client services. So on that front, can you tell me in 2 sentences, who is this client? What are they doing? Why are we building them a site, right? Like, what is the site supposed to be doing for them? And so you'll get engineers who kind of like fall in that hole of like, wow, I've totally forgotten that this is a website for like legal cases. And so maybe I need to think about the fact that they want to manage PDF documents all the time, right? Because those things are going to impact those decisions that you make as an engineer. So if you have forgotten your North Star of like what this is, you're going to have a really hard time making good decisions later, right? So so can you, summarize to me in like 2 sentences of plain English what you're working on in the first place, right? And then from there, can you then clearly define functional requirements for, whatever is going on the site that support that summary of what you're working on, right? So those are things that, for a lot of our projects at 10up, they're requirements, right? So we make those documents as a part of our engineering process. But when you're looking at, especially when you're talking about engineers who really want to grow, right? Who want to show that they're growing and their skills and upskilling and all of that, really challenging them to put out a document that shows more of that thought, right? Like a document that isn't just like, here's a screenshot of something out of Figma, and I think these are the like bits of data that go into this like UI component or whatever, right? Like something a little more thoughtful. Like, I think they'll need to manage this. What happens in the future? Here's something that we can tackle, in this development cycle, but here's something that maybe we should propose to them as like a future enhancement, right? As a part of being like consultative partners, right? So do we have all these bits and pieces? Like, are you thinking in that way? So like, do you see yourself as like an engineer, a senior engineer, a lead, where do you see yourself, or a director? Because, like, are you more thinking about like the velocity of other developers, making you more of the director type, right? Or are you thinking more about like, how do we solve for this technical challenge in an interesting way, which makes you more of like the tech lead type, right? So all those things are super interesting, but they all, to me, really do end up coming back to like, do you remember what it is that you're making, right? So that you can make good decisions. Because like, if we don't have good UX, like nobody cares what we're building, right? Like, who cares? If you made the world's most performant, cached perfectly, using all the new technology website, if like it isn't enjoyable to use, right? Nobody cares.
Well, the thought that's coming to my head, and sorry, Ceara, were you gonna say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say it's so interesting those steps that you were talking about for developers that they should take, because it's super similar to what we do in design. I think there's just like a really interesting parallel there because, I was thinking about this idea of like archaeology and stuff like that and decision making. And so like we, especially for complex projects, we'll have like a design rationale document. So it's a working document, and you start at the beginning, you're like, all right, I think our onboarding is just going to be a login. And the reason why I think that is because blah. I think for the homepage, we're going to go through, take a bit of a different approach. We're going to do it in this, these sort of sections. I think it'll work because blah. And we'll sort of go down the list of all of the feature areas and sort of do that initially, and then just kind of like strike through our logic that doesn't make sense anymore. Because it is so damn complicated, and decision and really like parsing out like, oh my God, how did we actually get to this? When things get chaotic and like really that deadline is like just like breathing down your neck and you're freaking out, you do weird stuff. And it's and kind of keeping track of that, or it's almost like a journaling sort of idea as like you actually write a thing down. You're applying a I guess intentionality is like the best thing to say there, but you are really focusing in on those details, and those overall goals, because especially with like UX stuff too, if we don't have a user experience goal, that's really like, we have a problem that we're solving. Okay, that's cool. But like our goal is going to be kind of like quick, getting through it quick, or it's going to be that people really understand what they're trying to buy, like with like a fintech thing or something or whatever. And because it just gets weird so quick. So I just thought that was really interesting that you get people to write things down, because I feel like as weird and wacky as this sounds, like in our tech world where we're working as knowledge workers and we're using these brains, we like don't write things down.
Stuff's just not going to make sense when you see it in black and white written down. Like just in your user brain kicks in, ladies. That's what it is. Your user brain kicks in when you actually write things down.
Because you think about somebody else reading it. Right? You're like, la la la. You're like writing it. You're like, oh wow, this makes no sense. If someone is reading this, right? But in your head, you're like, oh, it totally makes sense. But when you get the little like instant reflection that comes out, and you're like, oh no, I went to fairyland and I can't escape.
And I think that plugged in with that, that one of the maybe negative side effects of agile. Gonna say blasphemy now. Of moving fast, breaking things, experimenting constantly. And sometimes when you're on that hamster wheel of just put out designs, put out code, build, measure, learn, even that, maybe you get into such a routine of just producing work as a technologist, so as a designer or developer, that again, that moment of slowing down and making that connect, it feels like a distraction or a waste of time from that, from as you said, Helen, the goal that actually matters, which is making things that people like. When we're just like, but it's our job, we need to be productive and produce.
Something that I also like, I understand it from like, how do you run a consultancy and like, how do you manage budgets and timelines and resourcing and all that stuff, right? But like this idea that you can just like cleanly hand off, right? Like the design to developer handoff, right? And it's like, I don't think that I agree with that. I understand that I can't be like, hey, designer, let me bug you every 30 minutes for the, the remainder of this project. Obviously, I can't do that either. But there are still times where, like a really good specific example of this is where you get designs where you have very limited space for something, right? And like, no matter how much we talk about like designs that flex the content, there are always going to be designs that have like little tiny things where you have like a rough estimate of a character limit, right? Something like that, where you'll be like, okay, this little label area should contain no more than 35 characters. And it's like, but what if they're like all a bunch of W's and M's, or it's a bunch of L's and I's, right? Like it could be different based on how wide the letters are, right? So like a hard stop. So you hand that off to a developer and they'll be like, okay, 35 max, can't type past 35. And it's like, but this doesn't actually like solve for anything. Right. And like a big thing that is changing in WordPress is we have this newer editor experience that uses these blocks, and they're supposed to be like, you edit in place, like visually. Right. And so you have something like character limits, and they are no longer relevant for many reasons. I mean, there's also like responsive design, right? It's like the character limit for something that might change. I don't know. But when you have this experience of like, rather than like you're typing into a form field where the developer has taken the design document very literally and put a hard stop at 35, instead of having this like disconnected form field, you're typing in place in that little like tiny text area, and then you can see, does it fit or not, right? Because like as a developer, yeah, like I still have some worry that they're going to type something that's too long, but you still need to put that trust back in the user that they want their stuff to look good at the end of the day, right? And so if you give them like that more visually driven experience, an actually good user experience that doesn't rely on an element of surprise, you saved your stuff and now here's what it looks like live on your site, but instead you get to edit visually in real time, right? Then you can trust your user again to make the decision for themselves. Like, is it okay if it overflows a little bit? Or maybe I want it to be even shorter and I'm not trying to fill all 35 just because I know that's my limit. When you have that understanding of like where you've come from, what you've tried before, what you ideally would like to do, right? It also helps you, make decisions about trade-offs too, right? Like to stay efficient, right? Like we've had something very recently that I was working on, where I had outlined some of the functional requirements, and in there were some nice to haves, right? And instead of an engineer falling down for hours and hours chasing this thing, right, that I felt would be like from a UX perspective, the ideal to have in like the publishing area. But instead of having that and just like letting them fall, like I kept asking them, like, what do you think? Like from the developer perspective, I'm aware that this is probably a big lift, right? And so instead of you taking me saying like, this would be nice to have, or like, I would like this thing as gospel, you come to me and say like, here's how much time I think this is going to take, or just like how freaking hard it's going to be. Does that match the UX benefit of what's going to happen? And and in some cases it was like, no, not at all. So let's try this other thing that could give us like 80% of that benefit for, like 10% of the engineering effort, right? So like, instead of them being like, okay, well, UX says I have to, so now I'm going to burn endless hours, or I resent UX for asking me to do something that's impossible. It's like, no, we have to be able to go back and forth because like, we're reasonable people, right? Like when I'm putting on my UX hat, I'm still a reasonable person, right? And I understand like sometimes the amount of effort it takes to get to the ideal, not even remotely worth it, right? And so like, let's talk to each other. You as a developer, right, more familiar with the system, right? I'm a little bit of a weird case because on the developer side, like I do actually know, but to give them the opportunity to like, grow as a developer, to come back to me and be like, hey, this isn't working out, but here's a thing that I think could actually get us most of the way there, right? To have that dialogue is super important, and I think gives you better overall results, right? Where you don't have, you're still getting a good, experience outcome. It still looks good, it feels good, but also your developer is not feeling bad, right? Your developer still feels good, you still feel good, right? Like all these things on balance.
Yeah, that's what I like to do when I'm documenting kind of larger designs and stuff. I'll just say like the UX, like a micro UX goal for like this area. And usually I'm like, okay, look, I want the dev team to actually use that rationale to figure out alternatives, because most of the time you don't need the way that you designed it specifically is literally the only way that it can be done. Like it's just like that as a designer, you have some go-tos, and that was your go-to for this thing, but also the same thing can be done in like 4 ways. So if the overall UX goal is like, expose this and that information really clearly or whatever it is, then we're like, oh, okay. So now you have some good kind of rationale to use to figure out how we do it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Ladies, we've had a very interesting chat. Lots of great productive rabbit holes that I like that we've gone down. And we're going to bring this chat to a close. And as we do that, I'd love for each of you to share maybe one or two kind of like top level highlights slash takeaways that you'd like anybody who's listening to kind of just to take away from this conversation. It can be from your perspective as a developer, as you know, from your role as director of open source initiatives, Ceara, from your perspective as a designer that's worked with larger development teams. What is, if somebody who's listening is like, okay, great, I'm motivated to become more user-centric and to kind of like bring some of this like into my day-to-day workflow, what's some advice that you would give them?
I think my first one would be what I was talking about at the very beginning, to be really mindful and deliberate in thinking about how you are using a thing. So make a practice out of using the thing that you're building, especially if you're working on user-facing software. I mean, all software is user-facing, I guess, but like a non-technical user. So really making a practice out of using it. And then as you're using it yourself, really being mindful about like, here are all those little tiny decisions that I'm making in order to get here. And as a side thing, I think that a related thing that's also really good for is being mindful of that same thing in your body, right? Especially like in pandemic times, we're kind of like at home a lot more maybe than we would be otherwise. So like really be thinking about like, how do I move throughout the day? How is my body feeling, right? So like that same awareness of yourself that, you know, is really easy to forget about, that same awareness of like, how do I use software, right? Like, how do I step through things and how am I thinking about it? And then also like that collaborative kind of conversation, instead of seeing, you know, UX and design as like dictates that you have to follow as a developer, like being aware enough about like, you know, they're also designing for like ideals or for the moment, and like I can still collaborate with them. I can be a part of what's being built and not just the executor of a thing, right? So like I need to be involved in the process, and you know that almost certainly means that you're going to have to learn some amount of like terminology or like basic concepts in order to be able to communicate effectively, right? But to like really take part in it and not be like, okay, they handed it off to me, that's it, right?
Awesome, thank you, Ceara.
Yeah, I guess I would say probably to developers and designers that from what we've talked about today, it seems clear that having a bit of a process of writing things down can prevent a lot of gotchas. So I think that from the development perspective, you know, we always say gotchas in development. So I'm like, haha, Helen said that. But I guess I would challenge both designers and developers to expand their perspective around what's productive. Because for both designers and developers, what you write is very important. How you communicate your logic is very important. Because fundamentally, we're doing very complex stuff. And if we don't keep track, our memories do suck. We have limited cognitive abilities. I'm sorry, it's a human thing. It's not a personal thing. We need to write things down to stay sane. So that's kind of what I would say as my strong statement. You know, we have a lot of creative problem solving that we're doing every single day. And so we need to apply some of that creative problem solving or creativity into the way that we document and communicate what we're doing. So do not be afraid. You guys can do it. It's very doable. You just you know, write it down on a napkin, put it into your Confluence document. That's at least something.
Could be as simple as that.
Yes.
As simple as that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for taking the time and sharing all these like super insightful and thoughtful things around like practically what like being UX centric or user centric means for developers and for designers. if people want to hear more from either of you, where can they find you online?
I suppose you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Helen Hosundi, my whole name on Twitter, and yeah, easy to find there. I think that's probably the simplest place to go.
Awesome, thank you.
Nice. And you can find us on Pencil and Paper UX on Twitter as well. We've also got a new design SOS course for developers specifically. So if you're curious about that, that's labs.pencilandpaper.io. Yeah, and just hit us up on the Twitter as well. Just say hi. And if you apply any of these ideas or things to your workflow, please tell us, because it would be so cool to hear.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
All right, guys, thank you for listening, and see you at the next one. Bye.